Wow, so there has really been a lot going on in the world recently. We're about 6 months into the Trump administration, and it feels like a billion different things have happened that I can't even keep track of. I know that several of our last episodes were on the 2024 election, and honestly, I think some of that aged pretty well when we were talking about, Trump's ideology with tariffs and stuff like that. There is a lot of interesting stuff there. Obviously, the policy has been pretty incoherent across the board. And, today we're going to be focusing on a very just small part of that, which will touch on higher education policy, immigration policy, which is affecting universities in the Midwest, of course, including the University of Illinois, but also has a wide impact, not just across the United States, but this attack on higher education we're seeing has wide impacts across the world. So that's what we're going to be discussing in this episode. Before we do get into that, there's a few things I wanted to just kind of touch on since it's been a while since I've had an episode here. And, this podcast and this channel is usually focused on the Midwest and the politics of the Midwest with a focus on Illinois historically. So I did want to give an update on a few stories we've been covering that have had some recent developments, at least since the last episodes that we covered on them. So with the Illinois state flag, unfortunately, the public referendum did end with the current flag receiving the most votes. So it seems like nothing's really going to happen on that front. Illinois doesn't really have that much of a chance of getting a cool new state symbol. From what I can tell, there hasn't really been a whole lot of discussion around it since that vote went that way without a clear mandate for change, which you can argue about whether that's the correct interpretation of the voting results. It wasn't a majority for the original flag, but it was the largest, most popular flag option. So that's kind of it for the time being, unfortunately. And we also have some news recently that Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker is going to be running for re-election. We've talked about Pritzker and the kind of Midwest, vaguely sometimes populist, but generally more progressive Midwestern governors. In a previous episode with Nomadic Warriors for Pritzker, I will be releasing, I'm planning for it to be the next episode, a more in-depth video essay and podcast episode about J.B. Pritzker and specifically his life before he was governor, which I've been researching for a while, and you might have seen me tease on social media before, so keep an eye out for that coming up soon. Personally, I've been very busy these past few months. That's why I haven't been uploading much. I actually have been organizing in my workplace. We voted to form a union last month, which is very exciting. And I've also just, after that, I had a few weeks where I was on vacation in Europe, and that's actually where I recorded this episode while I was visiting my mom in the Netherlands, and we talked about, the attacks on higher education, both in the Netherlands and the United States, kind of bringing it all together in the bigger picture. So I hope you enjoy that discussion. I'm going to go ahead and run the intro now, and hope you enjoy that episode.
It therefore seems to me most important that you, the people of the state of Illinois, should know your university. Is it doing what you want it to do as the people's university? You are the owners, and your decision is final. Learning and labor. For the people and by the people. The people's university.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Learning and Labor podcast. Today, I am joined by a wonderful guest who is a professor at the University of Groningen. She studies sociolinguistics, which is, we will get into a little bit of stuff that relates to that topic today, but also just a general kind of overview of the situation of higher education where we are now in the Netherlands, and then also talk about what's perhaps a little bit more familiar with my viewers, listeners, the situation of higher education in the United States, how these may compare, how immigration, international relationships and everything interact with that. I'm very excited for that. And of course, also, I have to mention, that Professor Fuller is also my mom, in case you didn't know. But yeah, is there anything else? If you can maybe just briefly introduce yourself, anything I missed, name, pronouns, that kind of thing.
Yeah, Janet Fuller, she, her pronouns. I am, as Nico said, a professor of language and society here at the University of Groningen, but I also worked for 20 years at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. So I'm quite familiar with both systems, and it'll be interesting to kind of talk about some of the things that are going on in both places.
Absolutely. And since I didn't introduce myself yet, I am Nico Johnson Fuller, he, him pronouns, and I am excited to dive into this today. So I guess I just wanted to start with, I'm not sure how, everybody's going to differ in their familiarity with higher education in the United States and compared to the Netherlands. So maybe we could just start off by giving an idea of where higher education in the Netherlands is at. What are some trends we've seen over the last, decades, and what kind of moment are we in now? I know there's a lot of political tension around the internationalization of Dutch universities and some pushback against that.
Yeah, so just to give kind of a very brief background in history to the situation, and keeping in mind that I've been here for 8 years, so some of what I'm talking about is based on what I've been told happened before I got here. But between about 10 and 15 years ago, internationalization started kind of accelerating here in the Netherlands. And what that means is both hiring more international staff, which I think is something that happens quite a lot in the United States as well, of course, and having international students. But in this case, in order to have international students, you have to offer higher education in English, because most people do not learn Dutch to come and study in the Netherlands. And so increasingly, bachelor's programs are offered in English, and almost at my university, I think all master's programs are offered in English, unless they're like specifically about the Dutch language and literature or something. So that's something that's been accelerating. And what happened, it's almost 2 years ago now, was a law was introduced, was proposed, and it was talked about as keeping internationalization in balance. It was essentially an anti-internationalization law, and the biggest thing was to turn back and start teaching everything in Dutch. Now, this has, of course, huge consequences, not just for enrollment, but also there's a lot of international staff who, although they, in most cases, do speak Dutch, it's one thing to be able to go about your daily life in a language. It's another thing to master it academically. And many of these people are not English is not their first language, so they've already mastered a second language at a very high level. And now all of a sudden there was the expectation that they would just flip around and start doing that in Dutch. So this has caused a lot of anxiety, I think it's fair to say, and not just among international. Of course, no one wants to have to drastically change their programs and the way that higher education has been going.
Yeah, I guess I feel like this is something we see in the U.S. too, of this idea of we can just put the genie back in the bottle. We can kind of undo this dramatic change in how universities function. Obviously, the language difference is not as much of a factor in the United States, in that all courses are in English unless they're for a specific other language, and so international courses are also taught in English, and people are expected to come and be proficient in English, and that's not an issue because English is such a lingua franca. But there's also, we've seen in different political contexts, often like in more attacks on specific groups of either like protesters in the United States who are having their visas restricted, or like Trump proposing to like restrict Chinese international students as a specific like group. So more targeted focuses, but broadly a parallel attack on international students in the United States, which comes in a different form, but it's also, I think, kind of missing this bigger picture of, you can't really undo this situation without putting a lot of chaos out there. And I think that what people maybe don't also understand about the university from a financial perspective is that international students generate a lot of revenue for universities. And this is pretty necessary for a lot of universities to run properly in a situation where their funding from the government is under decline, certainly in real terms. In the United States, it has been over the last couple of decades, and I know in the Netherlands there's also been more recent attempts at budget cuts. And so it's kind of like coming at a lot of universities from both ends. Not only are you cutting their revenue from the public, from the government, but you're also cutting into potentially one of their other sources of revenue, international students, who are often paying higher tuition, are coming from not always coming from like super wealthy backgrounds necessarily internationally, but a large enough quantity of them are able to pay this high tuition that is going to the universities, and part of the reason why they're able to run the way that they are.
Yeah, and the situation is a little more complex in the Netherlands because it's only international students from outside the European Union that are actually bringing in a lot of more money. And those, since they don't bring in more money, in some ways, those European students are even less desirable.
Right.
I mean, in other ways, obviously, they're more desirable because this is all framed within, I think, in both the United States and the Netherlands, in the context of nationalist ideologies being on the rise, just kind of a lot of xenophobia. And it, in the Netherlands, well, I think in the United States as well, there's been some pretty explicit discourse from politicians about we want to get rid of all the foreigners in the country, right? So,
yes.
Here there was talk about them being, because of the housing market, that being a problem and so forth. It's definitely part of a growing nationalist ideology.
Yeah, and it's interesting to contrast I think, discourse and the depiction of the international threat that xenophobic people are talking about, and the actual reality of what is actually driving some of these issues. Like you mentioned, the housing market. The reality is, yes, of course, the housing market is impacted by people coming in from other countries and purchasing properties and stuff like that. That's natural, but ultimately, the housing market is still broadly controlled by the people with power in the country, and the people who own large amounts of property, so large landlords and real estate agencies and so forth, and also the government and universities, and institutions that work with the government to provide housing and ensure there's an adequate amount of housing. They're ultimately responsible for this, not people who happen to move to the country and of course are going to need a place to live, because that's, I think, often what is missing in these conversations. And also, I think the class element of this is kind of often missed a little bit when right-wing nationalists are talking about immigration. There's a difference in the impact from a wealthy person coming in and buying a house and potentially driving up the price of the houses in the area versus a working class immigrant coming in. The economic impact is different. The way that it's perceived is different. Often the people who might be, racist towards, immigrants of color are not really going to care if it's like a rich white European person coming in, even though that person might actually be more responsible for what they are claiming to be against. And I think it's kind of frustrating when you look at that dynamic and you see these very simplistic narratives that are resonant with a lot of people because they, see these issues in the housing market, or they see other economic struggles they're dealing with. And it's not actually really telling the full story, but it's a simple one, and it's one that's able to be widely spread in a way that can be, very impactful and directly, in this cases, in the case of, the current governments of both the Netherlands and the United States are impacting the policy that are being put forward. And I guess just for some context, I know if people aren't as familiar with the Netherlands, the one main difference between the United States and the Netherlands in this time politically is the ruling parties has changed a little bit over time in the last, couple of decades. But for the most part, the center-right was in power. They're no longer the biggest party in the Netherlands, but they have been for a very long time in government. And so it's a little bit more continuity in that regard with contrast to the United States, where, you've gone back and forth from Democratic and Republican administrations.
Well, the last election in the Netherlands did elect a farther right.
Yes, that's important.
That government has now collapsed, so we're currently without actually an intact government. But yes, it has been a bit more consistent, except for this most recent election. But this attack on internationalization happened before. It was from the previous election.
Yes,
from the previous government. It was not this most right-wing government that proposed to that. They, of course, ran with it, but it was proposed by a previous, more centrist government, which is frightening.
Yeah, and I think, as an observer from the outside, it seems like a lot of center-right parties in Europe have adopted the far-right's position, at least in small parts, especially on immigration, in order to kind of try to stave off their appeal. But as I will often argue, if you're voting and you're voting on a xenophobic basis, would you rather vote for the mildly xenophobic party or the real thing, which, the far right is claiming to offer? So I think that's not always an effective strategy, but, we will see how that plays out in the future elections in the Netherlands and throughout Europe. In the United States, it's a little different, but because of the two-party system. But there are some interesting parallels of continuity across not necessarily attacks on internationalization of universities, but general higher education policy and decreases in funding for higher education, and also like anti-immigrant policy. So I guess one question I had for you is like, what do you think, we have these narratives around immigration and cost of living and these kind of things that are often discussed. But what do you think are some of the other reasons that might actually be driving this push against higher education? And why is the university this site for political struggle and being, attacked by many governments across the world?
So one of the things that I see increasingly is what I like to refer to as the war on knowledge, right? We don't like people who have expertise in things. And I think that this is part of a kind of anti-elitist movement. And I find that, I mean, I would not deny that universities do definitely have a tendency to be elitist. And I think that is even more true here in the Netherlands, where there's a very robust kind of hierarchy of post-secondary education options, and the universities are at the top, and there is a certain amount of elitism about that, which I think is a problem, and I think is something that kind of needs to be addressed. But also, universities generate a lot of research that provides society with technology and ideas and, urban planning and, all sorts of things that are beneficial from society. And that seems to be ignored, as if what academics do is abstract and theoretical and separate from society. And of course, some of it is, right? I mean, we can't pretend that there aren't people in academia doing things that are fairly theoretical and don't have much societal impact. But I know here at the University of Groningen, that is very much a criteria by which researchers are evaluated. What is the impact of your research? And so that's something that we all take very seriously. And I think that to put this in the mildest terms, I think that's something that academics have not sold very well, right? We're not very good at showing that what we do is actually relevant to other people in society. But I think that this is also maybe not global, but certainly I've seen this in the United States and the Netherlands and in Europe more generally. I think this kind of attack on knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. We don't want to be told things. We want just, and down with the elite. We want to get away from that, and certainly not provide money. And that's what is going on here. Not provide excess funding for people who we see as elitist and not valuable to society.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an important point, and it's interesting to see it's interesting you chose the term elite, because I think that's, that's certainly one way to frame it, and I think you're right about the accuracies in some sense of elitism within higher education, but I think it's also a framing that often fails to recognize the broader economic structure of society and looks at intellectuals as an elite rather than people with power and wealth as an elite.
Yes.
Which there's not that there's never any overlap between those two groups, but that they're not exactly the same thing. And I think it's worrisome because, like you said, research is. My feeling on it is that even what might seem like the most abstract theoretical research is still going to have use for society, because first and foremost, I think just you may get lost in the details of what a research is about, but just the act of research and learning as in and of itself is valuable. And I think that, it's important to reinforce that and to emphasize why that is important in the first place, why we care about higher education in the first place when we're talking about these conversations, and to not get too lost in the nitty gritty details of the, and just focus too much on the opposing side's argument, because I do think that it is valuable in and of itself, but also things that might seem one day theoretical might in the future become incredibly real and practical, because society changes and what is important in a society changes. I've heard examples of this in mathematics or something, where you have this kind of abstract concept of mathematics, and then later down the line technology evolves and it becomes something that is actually very important in the operation of some sort of more advanced technology. So you can see analogies to that in the social sciences as well, and I think that that's always going to be something at play. And I think research and education and learning should be defended in its own merits. But I also think that some of it is so important to society that it's almost ridiculous, like, that it's being come after in the first place. In the United States, we're seeing like research grants being cut for all kinds of things, from, you know, research on, you know, how to have more effective agriculture. You know, they may have used the word trans somewhere in the abstract or something when it wasn't even about trans people. Like, you know, you have like all kinds of absurd cuts happening, of course, a lot to health research, which is like literally saving lives and allowing for a lot of, you know, medical treatments to advance to a state where people are able to not live with horrible diseases as much. And, you know, these kind of things are integral to what makes up our society. And it's you know, sad to see the attacks being kind of so easily pushed through. When, you know, I think it's hard sometimes to you know, focus on that when there's so much other stuff going on in the world. But I think it is important to come back to that.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things, and as you say, I mean, I think there is a somewhat bias. I mean, to be fair, the budget cuts have not focused on just, you know, the liberal arts and social sciences. But I think that there is always this bias. It's like, oh, what, you know, social science, that's not really meaningful. It doesn't prove anything, and so forth. But I mean, I think one of the things that's overlooked, and here in the Netherlands, where there's a huge teacher shortage for primary and secondary school, that's where teachers are trained, right? I mean, also, of course, you can you can be a science teacher and everything, but the majority of teachers are are from these other faculties. And you know, then you have to kind of start wondering, how much of an uneducated populace does the government want if they're not even really interested in figuring out how to have primary and secondary education thrive? So
you see in the U.S. as well, like a lot of like legislation that's like, oh, well, we need enough teachers, so we're going to cut the requirements you need to be a teacher. And it's like, okay, so I mean, that might sound like a good idea because, yeah, of course we want more you know, teachers to be available. We don't have a teacher shortage, but what you're kind of, you know, what ultimately you might be realizing is that why are not enough people interested in, you know, going into the education profession in the first place? I mean, I think the economics of it all are very important to that. You know, teachers not being paid enough and so forth, but also I think just devaluing of education. And like you said, academics, you know, play a part in this, and like making the positive case for education and investment in education needs to be something that is, as a public good, at the forefront of all of this, because I think that's the only really way out of it, is to actually emphasize, you know, the reasons why we have these programs, why, you know, this is important in the first place. And I think also for like the internationalism question, I think there can be some nuance to like how exactly you want to see that play out. And I understand the impulse to say, hey, like, you know, this university is representing, or, you know, is helping people from this specific area of the world, right? Whether you say, you know, a Dutch university should primarily focus on helping Dutch people, or whether in Illinois, I mean, this is kind of language I've used before. So you know, the University of Illinois should represent and help the people of Illinois. I think that's like a very reasonable kind of way to look at things. I mean, I also don't think that helping the people of Illinois means never letting anyone else in ever, right? I think that those are not actually in conflict with each other in a situation where there's adequate research, or when there's adequate resources for higher education. I think the scarcity and the austerity is what creates this conflict. And I think that I personally felt like my experience as someone from Illinois going to the University of Illinois was enriched by the fact that we had international students. And I think that in many cases that is the case. That doesn't mean that, you know, there shouldn't be adequate availability and services and resources for Dutch people, or for, you know, people from the respective areas the university might represent. But I think you can find a balance there that doesn't veer into xenophobia and still recognizes the legitimacy of an institution being primarily focused on a certain area that it's based in.
Yeah, and this is one of the things, and I don't know that a lot of my colleagues would agree with me on this, but I've said from the beginning with this law to decrease internationalization, we should absolutely be teaching more in Dutch. But not instead of English. Many of the Dutch students want to study in English because of whatever careers they want to pursue later, and they have an international orientation, or they simply like English and they want to study in English. some of them want to study in Dutch, and we don't provide enough opportunities for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I also don't have a problem saying, we need to make sure that we adequately serve, students who come from families who live in the Netherlands and pay taxes in the Netherlands. I think we do want to do that, but that doesn't have to be at the exclusion of international students, because the international environment, I think, is, no one at my university would deny that that's very valuable. But you don't have to choose, right? We can do both of these things. We can serve the local community. And of course, international people come here and do research which benefits not just the Netherlands, but our province of Groningen, right? So it doesn't have to be one or the other. Those things aren't really that separate.
I guess another thing that we didn't exactly touch on, but I think talked around a little bit, but part of, I think, the anti-intellectualism is, it's something we've seen, I think, more common since, I would say, probably 2020, and I think during the pandemic, there was a very, there's been a heightened amount of, skepticism towards, vaccines and, the health industry specifically, or the healthcare industry, which, I'm all for skepticism of corporate power in healthcare and pharmaceuticals, but there is, because of the lack of a strong public health program in a lot of places that is able to properly communicate, what individuals should be doing, what is good for public health. I think that there's been this, this moment has kind of been seized by the right to use some legitimate skepticism of institutions and some failures to adequately respond to health crises in a way that has attacked not just the problems with these industries, but also the good parts of it, which, like vaccination and plenty of public health research, which is now seen as, this kind of there's a very fierce vitriol towards any kind of attempt at collective public health as a vision. And I think that that's been a big part of the anti-intellectual turn recently. And I think the alternative to that doesn't have to be this super intellectual thing, but I think educating people about understanding where power actually lies and who, and not just in the research process or when you're talking about public health or something like that, but just in general. I think that's part of what makes university so important, is that it not everyone is like me and they go to university and they come out a lefty or whatever, but I do think a lot of people are educated and understand the world, including how systems of oppression work, better. And I think that's something that can combat a lot of the simplistic narratives, whether it be about vaccines or immigrants or whatever. When you understand the world better, and this is borne out in evidence of how educated voters tend to vote, you're less likely to believe those things. Now, that doesn't mean you'll perfectly understand the world properly, and there's still going to be biases you're going to get from getting the university education in a liberal institution the way that you did. There's going to be things that come with that may have, inaccuracies or whatever because of that too. But I think that understanding that you're getting from that, the legitimate understanding you're getting from that, is part of the reason why there are the attacks on higher education, because for a certain class of, people, it's not really useful to have a society that understands why they are, in control. And I think that's not something that a lot of wealthy people want to be able to send their children to university, but they don't really care if people of lower incomes are able to send their kids to university, because that's not really important to their lives. And in fact, if more people, are able to understand certain things and learn, then they might start to question, why do you have so much money over there? And I think that's, you don't have to go to university to do that, but I think that is one way that people gain knowledge in our society that's very institutionalized. And I think that's attacking that is also an attack on just broader knowledge more generally. Even people who don't go to university benefit from that more knowledge being out there, and research and the media and all of these institutions are very connected, and the people working in them have been educated at universities, and that's how they're able to kind of produce this more information that's ready for the masses, rather than a more academic text, which everyone might not read, right? So on all levels of society, academia and universities are related to how people get their information, and I think that attacking it can shift the overall like information landscape in a way that benefits the right wing more, generally, in terms of like specifically on simplistic narratives that they're able to push through. Do you feel like there is been any kind of acknowledgement of maybe the difficulty of this rollback of internationalization? Like, has there been, like, is that pushback still happening? Like, how quickly is this actually going to happen? Is there going to be, like, is this something that will actually, like, devastate a lot of universities, or is it going to end up being slower and more gradual because of the pushback that is coming to this policy? Yeah. Do you have a sense of that?
Well, let me give the historical answer, and so I'll get to the happy ending
right
eventually. But I mean, the initial response of university administrators was uniformly, absolutely not. We do not want this at all. They then tried to accommodate, but one of the things that was suggested by there's a council of university administrators, but in one of the things that organization proposed was that, well, let us regulate this. We will teach more in Dutch, but you have to let us regulate it. Don't come with your abstract ways of doing this. And that has been more or less accepted. But the current, the law still is not passed, so nothing is 100% certain. But where it's going at this point is that current programs are allowed to stay as they are, but new programs have to have a much stronger justification if they're going to be taught in English. Okay. And I mean, it was indeed what happened was that there were very flimsy excuses, kind of like we need to teach this program in English because we want to teach it in English, kind of justification for having programs in English. So I think that the major impact that we were all afraid of with this law is not on the horizon. I think that it has created some issues and negotiations in terms of language policy and language use at universities. And also, frankly, that international staff, there needs to be support for and focus on international staff learning Dutch, which weirdly enough was not really a priority at the university. Right. So I think that it potentially, maybe even some more positive balancing things came of this kind of xenophobic bill. So
yeah, it is interesting that there was such a unified response immediately, and I think, I mean, I can't speak to the particular situation, but does it seem like because of that was why there was a better outcome? Like, I think if they had just rolled over right away, that it might have not led to this better balance and might have led to a more, at least a little bit more chaotic of a situation.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, every university administrator here recognizes that internationalization contributes to the fine reputation of Dutch universities, right? And so even if they hate internationals, which I'm not saying that anyone does, but even if you really are xenophobic yourself, you have to recognize for the good of your institution, and if you're president of that institution, you want it to have a good reputation, you need to support internationalization. So that was really never, that was always a strong resistance, and there was a lot of negotiation. There were also protests, and I think that did indeed have some impact.
Yeah, I remember hearing about some of the unions and just like general organizers and activists in the Netherlands were protesting against budget cuts, protesting, was some of the nature of the protesting just in support for maintaining an international environment, or was there less? It was
more about budget cuts.
Okay.
But I mean, all of this has been combined. I mean, but I have to say, and this is my, I'm not a political scientist. I'm a linguist, but I have read these laws, right, and looked at them. I think part of the problem and part of the reason why the protests and the pushback was effective is that they were very poorly conceived and written proposals to begin with. Right. They were fundamentally flawed, had a lot of logical flaws in them. Maybe also one or two things that, we could think about, right? Like, as I said, I don't think it's bad to say, hey, why don't we teach more in the national language? but the rationale behind them and kind of how they were proposed to be carried out was kind of impossible.
Yeah.
And in particular, turning over all these programs taught in English, turning them back to Dutch was really kind of an impossible situation. And so I think that I personally didn't really think that was going to happen at a grand scale.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, I don't know if you would consider me a political scientist as well. I only have a bachelor's degree, but I as someone who is very interested in the role of political institutions in situations like this, I think a lesson you can take from that in the Netherlands is that these institutions and administrators do have power to change how policy is set in education, and as well as the more grassroots movements of workers and students and people who are also directly affected by these policies. There is always an ability to stand up and say, hey, this isn't something we want to see. And the more united that is, at least in particular against certain policies, I think that the more powerful it is. In the United States, obviously we have very different forms of attacks on higher education, but I think we've seen varying levels of unity among university administrations, with there over time being a little bit of a increasing joint letters that were signed by a bunch of universities and things like that against certain positions of the Trump administration. But it seems like it took some time for them to kind of realize that hey, we need to be on the same page about this. And I think that once that started to happen, I think it was effective in certain ways, because you can either kind of concede and say that, hey, look, people voted for this government and we just kind of have to do what they say on everything. Or you can say, hey, people voted for this government, but also they're not going to be in power forever and they have to engage with their constituents, and everybody, is responsible for that. And, in a democracy, it's not just, you vote and then you go to sleep. There's a process of how things work, and part of that process is standing up against things you don't like and forcing the government to change their mind. Yeah. And I think that's a kind of an important lesson of democracy that this can also take, because as someone who has been an organizer on campus, you get the impression a lot of times that administrators don't want everyone else to think they have power over things. And they're more our hands are tied, the government said this. And it's okay, I mean, there's a sense in which that's very much true, but there's also a sense in which you're part of the environment that shapes this policy. And I think that's something that is important to understand. And I don't think a lot of administrators would I'm sure, accept that. But I think that there's, depending on what the issue is, they maybe don't want to have as much responsibility.
That can be a convenient excuse.
Absolutely.
Right? One thing, slight tangent here, but I think kind of drawing the U.S.-Dutch connection here as opposed to comparison, with all the stuff that's been happening to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the United States, the Dutch universities from the beginning have said, we are absolutely not going down that path. We are renewing all our contracts for diversity and inclusion. There was just at this organization of Dutch universities that I mentioned, they just last Friday had a unanimous vote in support of diversity and inclusion programs at Dutch universities. What that means in terms of funding might vary, mm-hmm. but that's very much a reaction. It's a very explicit reaction to what's going on in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So yes, they do have a lot of power to stand up and push back in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah, and that's an interesting example too, because in the U.S., my understanding of the executive orders was that it was mostly targeted at public institutions. So because the government can't really tell every private organization how it should run. And despite that, a lot of private organizations were okay, now's the time, we're cutting all our DEI. And it's wait a minute, no one actually forced you to do this. You kind of just did it because you wanted to do it. And even with the executive orders, it's okay, the federal government only has so much direct say on how universities are run. And I think that there was a kind of there's kind of always a fear of, it feels like the atmosphere in the U.S. is defined a lot by this fear of, well, what if they cut our funding? What if they do this? What if they do that? And I think part of it maybe is also because of how decentralized things are in the United States. I don't know if this is totally right, but I get the impression that in the Netherlands, obviously it's a lot smaller of a country, but when, we're talking about higher education policy, it seems like there's, a policy across the country that is set by the government, and there are, of course, differences between different universities, but you don't have this level of fragmentation you do with, like, the U.S., where the state policy can vary differently, and I think, because of that, it leads to a lot of, like, awkward situations where universities are getting some money from the state, they're getting some money from the federal government, and they're always kind of trying to scramble to keep their funding in a way that doesn't feel like it's exactly the same here. I don't know exactly how that works.
It's
but
much more unified. I mean, it's a very small country, as Dutch people are fond of saying.
Yes.
So,
yes.
But it is. I mean, there's a very limited number of universities, and then more vocational and technical universities. It's a much smaller number, and they work much more cohesively together.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, that I think that plays a role in that. But it's interesting to see. I don't know what the status is in a lot of U.S. universities, because, this all happened, like, right after I graduated from the University of Illinois, so I haven't been, like, as directly able to kind of see it unfold. But the impression I got is that a lot of places were kind of scaling back what they were doing over fear that they would be targeted, or at least, like, changing the... I've heard of a variety of public institutions, like, changing the name of what they're doing because they don't want to get targeted by the Trump administration. There's kind of a lack of willingness to do what you described in the Netherlands, of saying, we're going to be committed to that. Now, obviously, the government isn't making as much of a direct attack on these programs in the Netherlands, is my understanding.
Not at all. Yeah.
But it is still something that is interesting to kind of see play out differently. Do you feel like that having been, an academic in both places, do you feel like the diversity and inclusion programs in the Netherlands are comparable to what exists in the U.S., or is there some big differences? No,
it's a completely different history. Diversity and inclusion here is 5 years old.
Right.
So,
did that start in 2020? Because, like, after, like, Black Lives Matter,
and there was a national program. This was before I was involved in diversity and inclusion. So again, I'm kind of repeating what I've been told. But yeah, it was initially a 5-year project for universities. And so now is also the point where they would have had to anyway figure out how they were going to proceed.
Right.
But because of this international context, there's been a real doubling down, and, like, we are going to continue with we think this is important, and we're going to continue. And as I said, that doesn't necessarily mean that universities are funneling more money into it. Some of them are. Some of them are cutting.
Right.
But nobody is saying we don't think diversity and inclusion is important.
Interesting.
But, I mean, at this point, just to give a little bit of the context, in terms of the types of diversity that you can quantify and track and monitor and have programs, affirmative action type programs, we have binary gender and we have national Dutch versus international, and that's it.
That's all that they do in the Netherlands.
You don't have any statistics about race, ethnicity, sexuality. I mean, in the U.S., I don't think you track sexuality either as part of diversity agendas, but not race and ethnicity. I think that's the biggest thing that the biggest difference.
Definitely.
Right? So diversity and inclusion has been primarily about how many women are in higher positions in academia.
Right, which is...
And so there's a long way to go. So it's very, very different. It's very different.
That's definitely, I think, important for folks to understand. And I think it's interesting because I think, the attack on quote-unquote DEI came right after the attack on, like, critical race theory. And, right, like, it's like just kind of like another terminology that folks have adopted to attack... Yeah. I think just
and people don't know.
It's often very centered on race. So the fact that in some ways in the Netherlands they're kind of trying to just avoid that altogether is maybe part of why it's had a different response.
I mean, there are lots of historical reasons for that. But I do want to correct what I said. It's certainly not the case that diversity inclusion has only focused on that. Right. But in terms of, like, quota type programs to hire more women and tracking and monitoring. Of course, diversity inclusion programs look at all sorts of interesting types of diversity and fostering that and everything. So I don't want to misspeak there and give the wrong impression that but in terms of, like, hiring initiatives, that's very limited.
I mean, the impression I've got too is in the US affirmative action was never really a quota system in most places. I think there's this popular conception of it as like, oh, we'll just give the least qualified person of color a job or something. Like, that's just never been happening anywhere.
No, there's you've always had to hire qualified people.
Yes, and so that's kind of like what's frustrating about the conversations. Is I think there's just like a basic misunderstanding of what has happened, and I think personally, like, also the focus is often on elite positions in an institution, which I don't think that's like not important at all. I think having role models is important for people, and you want to have role models you can look up to. But also, like, just because of an individual's identity, that doesn't necessarily mean that doesn't necessarily automatically make their role in a certain institution like dramatically change the institution, obviously. And so I think it's like important to recognize like the limitations of that. And I absolutely think it's a good thing. And obviously, people who have experienced more oppression are more likely to be aware of things that people who haven't are not, and use that information and experiences. And I think that if we're going to be doing that, we should be thinking about gender, we should be thinking about race, we should be thinking about class as well. And I think very few places, the only example I know of a country actually doing that is Brazil, where there's basically a, I don't know the exact status of this now, but my understanding is in the first government that the Workers' Party had in Brazil, they instituted a policy where there is specific like income and class-based as well as racial quotas for public university student admission, right? Which is not necessarily concerned about like, what the elites of the institutions are, but more specifically focused on that and saying, I think the party also cares about, the first woman president was also from this party, so obviously they care about that kind of thing as well. But I think that's in my view a much more interesting kind of policy to talk about, because it's saying, hey, like, these public institutions need to actually proportionally serve the people who are from this area. And that includes, I think, using income, and that kind of gets rid of a lot of the issues that people often talk about with affirmative action. I think some of the more valid critiques of affirmative action programs, in that, you're not necessarily empowering the most impoverished people in a society. You're picking out a person who is already like at this, like, meeting a lot of the qualifications, who, rather than kind of changing the number of people who are able to get those qualifications, if that makes sense.
I mean, but one of the issues with quotas, as you said, or with focusing on people of a certain category being hired into especially top positions, one of the to use the binary gender example, because in the United States and the Netherlands, it's the same story. You have roughly 50% women and men at assistant professor level. It's reduced to maybe 30% women, or maybe a little higher than that some places. At the associate professor level, and at the full professor level, it's been roughly about 25%, right? Mm-hmm. So the question is, and one of the things that we've done here, and we've managed to raise it up to 33% women at the full professor level. That was the national target.
Right.
Creating positions for full professors that you have to hire a woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that gets you to that quota, but what we've learned historically is as soon as you stop doing that hiring, it goes back down. Right. So the question is not how do we hire female full professors, but what is it that is keeping women from progressing across this trajectory? Right. And this is something that obviously in the end, and that's not something that you can. That's something that has to do with environment and hidden biases and hidden work, and the culture of an institution. Right. Absolutely. And those are things that you can't change with policy.
Yes,
you can try to address them with policy, but you can't really change people's attitudes with policy.
Yeah, certainly just a singular policy change like that doesn't overnight change the rest of it, like you said. So I think that's important, definitely. And, ideally a kind of DEI, or, diversity and inclusion, as it's called in the Netherlands, can be concerned with the broader questions of how do you change the culture of an institution and stuff like that. But that does take time, and I think involves everybody kind of thinking about these things more seriously, and hopefully moving past, the simplistic, I think, understandings that are often talked about with affirmative action. I was always very confused by how it's talked about, and I think, I think that if you are interested in actually having a society that gives equal opportunities to everyone, you need to not only, make sure that there's policies in place that strictly allow for that, but also that, you're changing the culture of it. And I think that goes beyond just saying we support diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I've seen situations where that's like, to go back to the University of Illinois, and I think I've talked about this in the podcast before, that's something that the administration at U of I has been very open about, right? But they haven't been necessarily open to making sure that the number of Black students at the university is actually reflective of the proportion of Black people in the state of Illinois, right? Which is kind of what you think would be a goal, at least, if not something that you can instantly do overnight, of an institution that claims to want that. And I think that's, a complicated question of how do you get there, but I think that the fact that that's not even really talked about as a goal, at least from my understanding, and has been something that student organizers have pushed for, to have more Black students on campus, is kind of shows where that stated intent meets policy in a way that I think reflects often the issues with these conversations of not going beyond just conversation and actually changing the way the institutions work.
I mean, one of the cliches, which I like to espouse, is, diversity is a prerequisite for excellence, right? I think that one of the things that the difficulty with diversity and inclusion is that, of course, we're all used to doing things the way we do them, right? And
Mm-hmm.
when we're interviewing someone and they're very different from us, it's hard to think, oh, but this person would really fit into my team well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those are the conversations we need to have with ourselves, right? Because I think that on some level, people do recognize that diverse perspectives and people from different backgrounds or whatever type of diversity there is enriching. It's enriching for our lives, but it's certainly enriching for learning and research and teaching. But I think we all need to think about how we grapple with that and how we can be more inclusive and broaden our perspectives to bring that into the universities. Because I really do think that is the thing that will save higher education, is that we have these very diverse perspectives, and that makes us stronger.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Keep up the good fight at protecting the importance of education and learning for those of you who are involved in those kind of issues across, most of my audience is in the U.S., but, wherever you might find yourself. And, thank you so much for listening. Thanks for chatting with me, Mom, and we'll see you next time.
Happy to be here. Charlie.
Learning and labor. Station WILL has carried a special program this week giving information about the University of Illinois. If you have been a listener to these broadcasts, you have heard more or less about what the university does, how it does it, and what it hopes to do. Thank you, Dr. Willard.